It is my tremendous pleasure to welcome you all to the very first Nelson Lecture on Southeast Asia of this academic year. Today's speakers are Doctors Yatun Sastramidjaja and Berenschot for a talk on propaganda and public opinion manipulation in Southeast Asian cybersphere. As a short introduction, Dr. Yatun Sastramidjaja is an assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Her main research interests include, among many other topics and themes, youth and student activism, political culture, democratization, citizenship, and digital cultures and politics in Indonesia and Southeast Asia more broadly, in a transnational context. Her current research focuses on two related topics. First of all, she focuses on youth activism in Southeast Asia in relation to local histories of student protest and contemporary digital cultures of protest. Secondly, she looks at the ambivalent relationship between digital technologies and fragile democracy processes in Southeast Asia. Dr. Sastramidjaja has authored several articles and book chapters based on her previous and current research, and an edited volume entitled Between Activism and Authoritarianism, Digital Technologies and Democracy in Southeast Asia, as well as a monograph entitled Playing Politics, Power, Memory and Agency in the Making of the Indonesian Student Movement are, as far as I understand, still forthcoming. Looking forward to those. Dr. Berenschot is a professor of comparative political anthropology at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and also a senior researcher at the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. Studying politics in both India and Indonesia, his research focuses on the role of money and informality in election campaigns. And a second field of research concerns the character of civil society and citizenship in these countries. He has also been involved in various efforts to promote legal aid in Indonesia, particularly in connection to land conflicts sparked by palm oil expansion. Dr. Berenschot's current research focuses on three main topics: land conflicts, campaign finance, and public opinion manipulation through social media. He coordinates a collaborative research project on the activism of rural Indonesians against palm oil companies. Also, with researchers at the University of Amsterdam, like Yatun, and Universitas Diponegoro, Dr. Berenschot is working on a research project that studies how online buzzers are used to manipulate public opinion in Indonesia. Among many noteworthy publications, I particularly want to point you to the book that he wrote with Edward Aspinall called Democracy for Sale: Elections, Clientelism, and the State in Indonesia. Today's talk focuses on findings from their shared research projects, Cyber Troops and Public Opinion Manipulation, a mixed method study of social media propaganda in Indonesia, that Doctors Sastramidjaja and Berenschot have been working on in collaboration with Indonesian partners Wijayanto and Ismail Fahmi. Welcome, everybody. After the talk, we'll have a Q&A. You can raise your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hand, and Brian and I will make sure to keep track of the order of questions. Welcome, Yatun and Bart.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you for having us here. It's really nice to have this across the sea collaboration and interaction, which happens too little, particularly right now due to Corona. So this is really nice to be in contact with American colleagues in this way. Thank you for that. Yatun and I, we are colleagues at University of Amsterdam, and we work together on research on public opinion manipulation in Southeast Asia. So it's for us nice to kind of jointly present some of the research that we have been doing, some of the findings. The idea is that we're going to do a kind of dynamic duo presentation where I will say a few things to introduce the topic, and then Yatun will take over, and then I'll take it back. And I hope usually that's easier to do when you're in the same room. Now we'll just pass on the mic kind of virtually. I hope that will go smoothly. Let me just open my slides. Here they are. I think that works. Today's talk is about the role of social media in fostering or deepening democratic backsliding in Indonesia, and the particular threat that social media forms in Southeast Asian countries. So just to introduce that as a topic, I'm likely, given the audience here, I'm not saying anything new, that democracy has been backsliding or regressing, or whichever word you want to prefer, across Southeast Asia. We have Thailand and Malaysia as countries where this backsliding went the furthest into actual authoritarian regimes. But once bright lights in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia and the Philippines, really turned more and more illiberal, and a recent beacon of hope like Malaysia has also seen its progress threatened. And that kind of democratic backsliding has a range of causes. We're not going to say that we'll be fully explaining that phenomenon, but what we will be focusing on is the role of social media in exacerbating this trend. So just to frame that issue a little bit, in particular, when you see literature or people discussing a democratic backsliding, these three issues that I put here on the screen, you see often discussed: the weakening of checks on executive power, harassment and cooptation of opposition, as well as the curtailing of civil society and the media. And these trends come from authoritarian tendencies of rulers themselves, from polarization, from social tensions, in short, from a range of causes. But they also come from the way in which ruling elites have been able to use social media as a tool to manipulate public opinion for their own benefit. And that will be the main argument that we're going to present, and we're going to provide you with a number of illustrations to hopefully give concrete examples of how this works and how democracy is currently being undermined. And maybe we can end with a discussion also among ourselves on what this means and what should be done about this real threat. So just to give a kind of an outline of what the talk will look like, we're going to zoom in on three particular forms in which the three concrete forms that this takes. So three concrete forms in which elites harness these digital tools to manipulate public opinion. And that is cyber repression, and then we're going to talk about how cyber troops are being used to manipulate public opinion, and then how social media campaigns weaken opposition forces. As a kind of disclaimer, many of our examples will come from Indonesia, which is related, or the reason for that is that our research has mainly focused on Indonesia. Yatun will illustrate that more at more length. And we realized there might be people in the audience interested in other countries that we might not be catering to, but we do want to put forward the claim that the argument that we are making and illustrating with Indonesian examples, we feel it equally applies to Indonesia, to what's happening in Malaysia, as well as in a slightly different form, in Myanmar and Thailand or Laos, internet is being used by ruling elites. This is a broad trend that we're discussing, and maybe in the discussion we could move towards these countries too. So let me now move over, give the mic to Yatun to discuss the background.
Thank you, Bart. So I think you need to click one more.
Yeah.
So as Sylvia already introduced our collaborative project, and as Bart also explained, most of our research has been based in Indonesia. In this project that we're engaged in on cyber troops, computational propaganda, and public opinion manipulation, we began with a focus on Indonesia, but then we found so many interesting, trends and developments and dynamics that we wanted to compare more broadly, whether and to what extent and in which particular ways and due to which particular factors the dynamics that we found in Indonesia in cyber trooping and cyber troop campaigns also apply to other Southeast Asian countries. So as we last year have wrapped up our pilot project in Indonesia, which was mainly meant to also explore the field and try out a new mixed method strategy that we will elaborate in a moment. Now we want to use that same mixed method strategy in a comparative study on Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. And the main question there, as it also was in our pilot project, is how cyber troops are organized and how computational propaganda is disseminated in different political regimes, right? How these political conditions also shape these dynamics. So that's the main source for our lecture. And in addition to that, I was also very briefly involved in another project, a comparative study where we compared the politics and aesthetics of digital authoritarianism and protests in Southeast Asia and Latin America in collaboration with the Center for Latin American Studies here at the University of Amsterdam, where we investigated how new authoritarianism and illiberal governance are both contested by activists and consolidated by regimes in and through the cybersphere. And yeah, as Ward just mentioned, or as you saw in the previous slide, digital authoritarianism is, of course, a very complex, multi-layered and dynamic phenomenon. And this isn't just tied to one system of governments, right? And therefore, it's also too simplistic to think of digital authoritarianism in contrastive terms, such as, you know, as a polar opposite of digital freedom. And this becomes clear when we look at relative internet freedoms in relation to digital or the rise of digital authoritarianism. Next slide. And one more. Yes, so you can show, yeah. So, well, internet freedom was declared a human right by the UN Human Rights Council in 2012. Reports from the Human Rights Council itself, Freedom House, and other organizations, they indicated internet freedoms around the world, and especially in the global south, such as Southeast Asia, have been steadily declining. More and more internet users have been prosecuted and imprisoned, even in the past decade. Censorship, blocking of internet access has increased in more and more countries. And it's interesting to note that this trend actually started around 2010, according to these reports, which is, of course, the year of the Arab Spring uprisings, which are also known as the so-called Facebook or Twitter revolutions. So it can be argued that at least partly the decline of internet freedoms is related to the fact that governments have become wary of the ways in which social media could empower their citizens, right? To hold the regimes more accountable and threaten them as well. And declining internet freedoms, as you see in this illustration also, is also very much visible in ASEAN countries. They generally score very poorly, as you see in this illustration of the 2020 Freedom House report. But the case is also much more complex there in some of these countries, in particular the Philippines. And this case shows that there's not really a clear-cut correlation between internet freedoms as such and other indicators of digital or civic rights. So the Philippines in 2000 and 2018, and even before or before as well, it was still marked as the only free country in Southeast Asia in terms of internet freedoms. However, both back then and now, the Philippine cybersphere, yeah, it was anything but a safe space for internet users, right? It had the highest frequency and the nastiest forms of online trolling, harassment, and propaganda. So there's no clear correlation there. What is clear is that both in ASEAN and elsewhere, we see that digital authoritarianism in its various forms is increasing. And this also reflects the durability or the reconsolidation, one of these two, of illiberal authoritarian or autocratic regimes in the region, despite a massive surge in online oppositional political activity that we've also seen emerging, right, since the 2010s. And as we know, in Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar, this online action also translated into mass mobilization, which was actually very effectively suppressed. So you could say democratic pressures from society that have been increased and have been effectively stunted by this combination of older forms of repression and new forms of cyber repression. So the question is, how do these regimes do it, right? Next slide, please. Yeah, so how do they do it? First of all, through cyber laws. As you see in this box here, all Southeast Asian countries have implemented some form of cyber legislation, which is meant to control online information flows. And most of these, they're very different forms and very different kinds of formulations, etc. But all of these laws, as some of my colleagues elsewhere have also shown, they are similar in that they all cite concerns for national security and public disorder, which is much broader than just cybersecurity issues such as combating cybercrime and terrorism, right? And this also, you know, with this very broad objective, what these cyber laws are supposed to account for. This also means that there very vague definitions creep into these laws of what counts actually as cybercrime, what is a fake news, what is hate speech, what is defamation or immorality, etc. All these crimes that are liable for prosecution and imprisonment are nowhere really defined, and this gives authorities the power of interpretation, right? So what we see in all these countries, literally all these countries, is that cyber laws are increasingly used to prosecute and also silence critical journalists, civil society activists, and distance, and indirectly thereby also to deter online criticism. And I can briefly illustrate in the case of Indonesia, the ITE law is actually one of the oldest cyber laws in Southeast Asia, 2008. It has several provisions that are very vague on defamation, online threats, hate speech, and blasphemy as well. And none of that is really clearly explained in the law itself. And according to reports by Amnesty, digital rights group, SafeNet, and other organizations as well, the use of this ITE law to prosecute individuals for alleged online crimes has actually escalated rapidly in the current Jokowi administration. So they point out that from 2008 to the mid-2010s, only a handful of defamation cases were filed under the ITE law each year. But between 2016, and of course, Jokowi came to power in 2014, until 2020, more than 800 people had been prosecuted under the ITE law for defamation, violation of morality, as well as hate speech. And Amnesty has also shown that the conviction rate there was almost 97%, and almost 90% was also receiving prison sentences after being prosecuted for violating the ITE law. And many of those targeted were actually indeed journalists and activists. And this was especially clear during the two protest movements that we will discuss in this talk later on, where cyber troops were also operated around the KPK issue, the Corruption Eradication Committee, and the Omnibus Law controversy. So the ITE law is widely seen as intended actually to deter and silence protest in the end. And one thing that we also see throughout the region, and this is a global occurrence as well, is that national cyber legislation is often also used by governments to pressure internet service providers and social media platforms to block and remove content that are said to violate, you know, these cyber laws. Overall, which has been demonstrated by various colleagues, for instance, also for Malaysia, is that this has led to self-censorship rather than actual censorship measures. And this has a chilling effect on political expression, etc. Next one. Now, in addition to cyber laws, cyber surveillance is another increasingly popular mode of cyber repression. We see an increase of systematic surveillance of social media and messaging app contents, and different countries have different actors involved there. So information ministries may be involved, the armed forces may be involved, state intelligence agencies, and specially designated cyber police as well. And there's this ideal that, you know, this kind of surveillance mimicking sort of Chinese, very sophisticated surveillance techniques, that they try to implement a sort of human algorithm mix there in order to very effectively filter and detect this criminal contents that violate these previously discussed laws. But that is actually still very much in its infancy because, you know, it takes a lot of resources that many of these Southeast Asian countries just don't have to implement. But what we do see happening, in Thailand, for instance, is that sophisticated spyware such as Pegasus has been deployed to to survey activists and dissidents there, and it's quite unknown where else this is happening. There are rumors that a similar sort of spyware is also being used in Indonesia, but all this is very much shrouded in secrecy, and there's very little transparency from the government of what is and isn't used, because it's a matter of security threat, so not open for discussion. And similarly, like with the laws, the social media platforms are also pressured here by all these governments to comply with these surveillance measures and to allow these, the surveillance to happen on their social media platforms. Now, finally, there's just one more thing that I want to point out, and that's the rise of internet shutdowns. It's not as bad as in India, which has, I don't know how many shutdowns per year, but we've seen it happening in Myanmar, we've seen it happening in Indonesia recently. And another trend that we also see throughout Southeast Asia is that government starts speaking about a national or single internet gateway in Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia. So, so as to have full control of internet contents and information flows. And this is, of course, trying to mimic China's Great Firewall, but all of this mainly remains still on the level of discourse, because again, there's not enough resources to actually implement this, right? But the fact that it is a dream and that is being communicated by ministries of information is already saying something about how they see the internet as a space for, government control. However, many of these measures are very ineffective, actually, because dissidents and activists are very creative in dodging these kind of surveillance mechanisms. They use code language, they migrate to encrypted and secured messaging apps. And maybe you have heard of the Be Water strategy that has been adopted by youth-led protest movements in Thailand and Myanmar, for instance, where they constantly pop up somewhere, and use different Telegram accounts for last-minute announcement of protest actions. So the police cannot, actually follow them. This makes protests increasingly difficult to monitor, and more generally, the internet becomes increasingly difficult to monitor and control fully. And I wouldn't say that this has necessarily directly led regimes to the third strategy that we'll be focusing on, but it turns out that the mobilization of cyber troops, the actual topic of our talk, is actually much more effective than just the cyber laws and the cyber surveillance. And in the end, it's these three components: cyber legislation, cyber surveillance, and cyber troops working in tandem that are most effective in co-opting the cybersphere, you could say, for regime interests. Yeah. I think the next. So what are cyber troops? Cyber troops are also a new field of study, actually. They are known as organized networks of people, and this is also how we met them, or encountered them in Indonesia, who use fake social media accounts, bots, or automated bots, and other forms of automation to spread and amplify political propaganda and social media. And the purpose there is to interfere in and also to manipulate online conversations in order to influence public opinion and manufacture consent on certain contentious issues, such as controversial policies, as we'll see. Part of that is actually the fabrication and dissemination of disinformation, which is why the study of cyber troops has often also been subsumed under disinformation studies. But as we will show, cyber troops mean so much more than just the spread of disinformation. For instance, one of the task descriptions for cyber troops is that they are also attack, need to discredit, and thereby demobilize opponents. This is what we see happening. And since 2017, the Oxford Internet Institute has actually made an annual global inventory of cyber troops and computational propaganda, or what they call industrialized disinformation. And they show that over the years, cyber troops have been increasingly used by governments around the world, and not just, also in the global north, not just the south, by governments, political parties, and other political actors. And this has been proven to be the case in 81 countries around the world. And they call this a real threat to democracies around the world. So this supports our argument in that sense. Next. And we see that cyber troops in Southeast Asia are also extremely prevalent and active. According to this Oxford study, cyber troops that not only spread propaganda, but also actively target civilian and political opposition, have been found in 7 ASEAN countries. As you see here, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. And what the report doesn't show, Oxford, and what our research hopefully will show, is how different cyber troops might operate in different national political conditions. What we do know so far is that there's roughly 2 types of cyber troops at work in the region. Either they're more or less tied to the army or are actually a semi-official army division. This is what we see in Thailand, in a division called Information Operation, or in Vietnam, an army division called Force 47, which actively, spread propaganda on social media. But what we have found in Indonesia, and this has also been found by Jonathan Ong and Jason Cabañas for the Philippines, is that usually they form more shady networks that are organized by political brokers in a very hierarchical manner, as we will show. There's many other forms of cyber troops in Myanmar. There's pro-government Twitter surges. There's in Malaysia very partisan internet trolls that work very differently again. In Cambodia, we have the click farms that we don't actually see in Indonesia as much. But whatever the form, a recurring theme throughout the region is the weaponization, you could say, of patriotism. Where nationalist themes, patriotic themes are really mobilized to spread this propaganda as well as to attack opponents. And in doing so, identity politics, so the exploitation of ethnic or religious sentiments, the performance of polarization, especially during elections, are very common as well. And here in this illustration, you see what happened in 2016 in the Philippines. Around the election time, there was suddenly this red dot, is Duterte back then. A sudden peak in conversations mentioning Duterte on Twitter, mostly in a positive way, and obviously this was the work of cyber troops. Bart, I think you take over now.
Yes, and I will be discussing some of the findings of our research on actual cyber troops and their functioning in Indonesia. And I'll start with just one definitional remark on like what are cyber troops really and how is it different from other forms of online politicking. And having looked at these kind of people, how the cyber troops, how they function in Indonesia, we came up with these 2 by 2 just to clarify this, that the cyber troops we're talking about are teams or networks of online mercenaries who are hired by donors, funders, to spread political content in a largely anonymous way. So if you want to distinguish cyber troops from other forms of online activity, it's just those 2 criteria, that they are paid, they're funded, and they do so largely anonymously. And I will give you some examples of these accounts that are not associated with names. They are rather often is one individual holding between 20 to even up to 100 accounts, and that use all these accounts to disseminate content that is beneficial to their funder. That's what a cyber troop is, and why it's different from, say, the kind of political trolling that you see, probably you guys experience a lot in the US, which is often unpaid activism or openly digital marketing. Cyber troops is a bit in the shade, it's anonymous, but it is paid and there's a lot of money involved. So we studied this. I'm gonna very briefly say something about the background. What we set out to do was basically combine online analysis of behavior on Twitter, on how tweets are being distributed, and the content of them. And we combined that with actual field work on the people doing that, spreading that content, which in Indonesia are often called buzzers. So we contacted them either through direct messaging or because some of our researchers, and you see them here in the screen, some of them who have been buzzers themselves knew them or could contact them. So we use those two strategies to get in touch with these buzzers and to have longer interviews. And in total, we managed to track down 76 of these buzzers involved in different campaigns to get behind the way that it's that they function, that they're organized, as well as their motivation. And what we're going to present is a bit of our findings from this. We're going to discuss in a moment few concrete campaigns that they do, but here first some overview of what these cyber troops are and how they function. So what we found, and this is very different perhaps from what you associate with online influencing, which often is discussed in terms of these click farms or companies that do this in a very organized and institutionalized manner. What we found in Indonesia is that the cyber troops are instead very fluid networks of people that are like freelancers that take up a certain campaign, throw some money out of it, and in return take up a certain task in posting and distributing content. And what is important here is that these networks have a division of tasks. So we mentioned these roles here. They're usually led by some sort of coordinator who has contact with the donor, the funder. We'll get to those also. But who takes the money and who hires the actual foot soldiers, which we call buzzers, to spread content. And they also hire and employ people that we call content creators, who make some of these nice memes, but also who strategically think about what kind of online messages, what kind of tweets would work best to serve our donor. And all of these work anonymously. And so usually what a coordinator does, it takes the content from the content creator, shares that to this kind of army of buzzers, and often, and later there will be some illustrations, tells at a specific moment when this content should be distributed in order to make a topic, a trending topic on Twitter. A bit of an outsider person in these campaigns, but still relevant, are influencers. They're a bit exceptional because they are not anonymous. They are people that are very well known, have a lot of followers, they're celebrities often, at least online, but they are approached by coordinators and asked to also share certain content for often quite serious money. So they are really selling their celebrity status in return for supporting certain political views. Okay, so that's the general network of a cyber troop. What is also relevant to mention here about the brokers is that they actually work quite hard to kind of nurture and raise their account. So when you start out as a buzzer and you just make an account, you're obviously not very effective because you don't have any followers. So what buzzers, particularly if they're very serious about their work, what they do is that they spend quite some time getting more followers online. So that starts with just spreading interesting content about a soccer match, gossip about a movie star, some opinions about music, books even, so that people come to these accounts for their broader content, start following it. And then once they have a certain amount of followers, they can sell that to a coordinator and say, look, how many followers I can have. I can join your campaign if you pay me this much. We'll get to the amounts. And then they start mixing this kind of broader content with political messages. And then they are most effective in making a message go viral. Who are these people that do this? Of the 76, I forgot the percentages, but most really overwhelming majority are men, very well educated, and often get into this topic, interestingly, because they do have a political view and they like a politician, we found in Indonesia. and then they are hired to join the campaign of a politician for the social media work, and then realizing gradually that this makes money, and then often the ideology or idealism gets lost, or at least partially, and they take this on as a job. We might discuss later in the Q&A the motivations, but that's our general summary of the finding. Here's just an example of a very successful buzzer account, so an anonymous account, but with 190,000 followers, tweets about a range of things, but also then takes up certain political topics here, commenting on political corruption inside the Democrat Party as a way to likely support a campaign targeted against the Democrat Party that we'll get to. So this is the kind of accounts that you have to think about when we talk about these buzzers, although this is a particularly successful one. And here's something on the amounts that we found. So because we asked them, of course, how much do they get? Buzzers get usually paid per account. And as I mentioned, as they often have about 20 to 100 accounts, this can still amount to a decent salary. And while content creators and particularly coordinators get paid much more. And what's the key takeaway here, and what we found interesting in our interviews, is that this has developed into an industry and to a normal freelance job. And that was also something that actually helped our research, because for the people that we interviewed, it was not a sense that they were doing something shameful or wrong or something to hide. Many of them we found surprisingly open, because they felt this is a job. We just distribute content for clients, and this is what we do. We get back to the ethics of this at the end of our presentation. And then the special position, as I mentioned, is the influencer, who can make serious money out of embracing certain political positions. And this seems to be happening quite often. And we even have examples of people trading their online support for actually getting a government position in Jokowi's government. So they have serious leverage. This I said already, so let me move on. So now let's make it concrete, because I can imagine there's a risk that this sounds abstract, cyber troops. Now, how is this actually used? And what can we say about the actual political effect of this? And we're going to discuss two examples of how policies were sold, and one example of how opposition was attempted to co-opt. I will start with the first example, which is has been a very contentious issue in Indonesia, bringing a lot of people out on the street. And that was the initiative of Jokowi's government in, 2019, to adopt a new law, the revision of the Corruption and Eradication Commission law, that would kind of shape or reshape the mandate and the rules under which Indonesia's Corruption and Eradication Committee would function. But basically summarized, it would weaken this commission, because it would put the commission back under political control, which was a long cherished wish of political elites who were suffering from the fact that KPK in Indonesia had been very successful in putting politicians behind bars. And given the rampant corruption that politicians feel they need to engage in to win elections, the KPK was a threat. And this was an attempt to silence that threat, which obviously worried a lot of people and brought many people out on the street. But what you saw then was gradually a campaign that came off the ground to sell the idea that a new law on the KPK was needed. So while earlier you saw tweets that are as most popular about if KPK is strong, then corruption goes down, gradually you see this spike here of tweets around the theme of KPK and Taliban. Now, this I need to explain. This was a conscious strategy, likely of some of these content coordinators, to sell this election, this KPK revision bill, as a way to control the KPK, which was needed because the tweets claimed the KPK was being infiltrated by extremist Muslims, by the Taliban, and they had come up with certain memes and some sort of illustrations that were supposed to prove this. And in doing that, created the idea like, yeah, we need to curtail extremist Muslims, and if this KPK is infiltrated, we need to adopt this law. Partly doing that by all sorts of giveaway quizzes. You can see some of these tweets here that actually tweet under the name of some sort of giveaway things that would say things like this one, like if you tweet the KPK need to obey the law, so meaning there should be a new law to make sure it does, then you'll get this 50,000, you'll partake in a lottery for 50,000 rupiahs, about $3, $4. So that was one way to attract people. Another one was creating this kind of content. And here you can really see where these cyber troops get to work, that these memes, these visual things look much better than what the opposition to the KPK bill would put out. It was designed, there was a quote, nicely layouted, and they would all be about, look, really, we need to support the revision of this bill, and they would quote political leaders that would have said so and spread the idea that this is commonly shared, this idea. And that caught on, and what particularly worried us that Indonesian newspapers very often uncritically posted something when a topic went with the excuse that the topic was viral and trending on Twitter. So we found, for example, 250 articles in newspapers and online media about KPK and Taliban, with often claiming, look, this is online, there's a lot of gossip, people are worried that KPK is infiltrated by the Taliban. Totally nonsense. And also these articles didn't investigate it, but in doing so, they really amplified the work of these cyber troops and made it much more effective. And here we actually, in this case, we have, well, it's very difficult in this field to really show the impact of such a campaign. Here we have some indication that it worked, that in public opinion polls before this whole campaign, the KPK was one of the most popular institutions of the country. And in this survey that came after the campaign, you can see here top left, the majority of the people, or at least 44.9%, where they were okay with revising this law. So while this is not full evidence, at least circumstantial evidence that this campaign succeeded in influencing a sizable part of the population. So that's a first example. Now Yatun will continue with another example of such a campaign.
And if the KPK case was already giving some circumstantial evidence, you know, it became repeated in every case that we actually investigated in this research project. And this was very much shown also in the second example that we're going to discuss here, which was actually a fourth case or so in our research, because in between KPK and the omnibus law, there was also the new normal policy that we investigated, which also shows similar impact. But let me just focus on the omnibus law controversy here. The omnibus law, as some of you may know, was a very controversial bill tabled by the Jokowi government and accepted or implemented passed on the 5th of October in 2020. And it was like the KPK revision law. It was very much contested by a very broad section of civil society. So not just the people, the students, as you see here, and the laborers out on the streets, but religious organizations, all kinds of civil society groups. So there was massive support for protests against the omnibus law. And there were already plans for national strikes, etc. But then, of course, the pandemic struck, right? And protests had become completely impossible. Next slide. And this is when the protest against the omnibus law took online and took a flight online as well. It became much bigger than if there weren't a pandemic, because everyone was stuck at home and wanted to join the action online, which had massive impact actually. So as you see here in this sketch of talk on the omnibus law in August, there was a massive group of people that tweeted all kinds of hashtags, for instance, but also messages and memes, etc., that clearly opposed the omnibus law, while the pro-omnibus law camp, if you will, was very much marginalized in our social network analysis of Twitter conversations on the topic. And this worked because there were also very concerted Twitter hashtag actions organized by all kinds of civil society groups and activists, which led, for instance, to this kind of successful action where they called everyone, all netizens on Twitter, to tweet these anti-omnibus law hashtags at the same time in order to flood Twitter with anti-omnibus law narratives and hashtags. So they succeeded in that. More than 1 million people at several points tweeted anti-omnibus law hashtags. So it seemed that the government was losing the battle for public opinion, right? But the speed by which things then turned around, similar to the KPK case, again showed the impact and the effectiveness of mobilizing cyber troops. Next slide. Because the peak that we saw for the anti-omnibus law camp, so to speak, it was very swiftly drowned out on the in the Twitter sphere by cyber troops, which at some point around the time that the law was or that the bill was going to be passed in Parliament, began flooding Twitter with all kinds of different narratives. And this pro-omnibus narrative had two sides, actually. On the one hand, it was very much promoted, the omnibus law, right, as the way out for Indonesia out of the pandemic crisis, out of rising employment, and this wish for promoting investment, both foreign investment and domestic investment, would be a benefit, a blessing to the whole of Indonesian society. So that was the positive story. But at the same time, Twitter was also flooded by negative stories, especially once the protest broke out on the streets. And like the previous example that we saw in the KPK case, the target was actually also, besides activists, as we will see in a moment, was also the largest political opposition party, Democrat Party in Indonesia, which was frequently accused of having manipulated and masterminded the protests against the omnibus law. And here's some proof of how they were responsible for all kinds of anarchist actions during the protest. Next one. And we saw this turn of events also very clearly on Twitter in our social network analysis. So on 5 October, it was still the same strength, you know, the same kind of balance or imbalance of power that we saw in August. A lot of people, a lot of netizens were still opposed to the law, and thus supporting it was really a marginal minority. But within a time span of 1 week, we saw that this balance was more or less tilting, right? So on 16 October, those opposing the wall were still strong, but the pro camp was gaining ground on Twitter. And at some point, to be exact, after October 16, they had completely drowned out the contra camp. And you can see that in the graph here, where we traced per day, actually, which of the tweets and hashtags were most dominant on Twitter. And Here, the opposition was still, or the protesters were still very strong with their anti-omnibus law hashtag actions. There was also a very prominent role played here by K-poppers. Maybe you know who they are. We might discuss them later on. But at some point, so here 16 October, different kinds of hashtags took over. Omnibus law is a blessing to the nation, etc. And all these anti-omnibus law hashtags suddenly vanished. They disappeared, not just because they were drowned out, but because, as mentioned, a lot of activists were actually prosecuted by the ITE law, which kind of scared other netizens off, right? Because they don't want to be prosecuted as well. Next one. Now, interestingly, and this is very different, or an evolution, you could say, from the KPK law case, is that there was also a very big role played in the omnibus law controversy by the national police, so an official institution, which actually came to work side by side for similar, for a common purpose, you could say, with cyber troops as well as with the mainstream media, which again amplified government narratives here. In selling the omnibus law, that is, in creating public consent on accepting the omnibus law as a blessing for the nation. And the role of the police became very clear, actually, in a leaked telegraph where the national police chief gave out instructions to his men. The telegraph was dated on October 3rd. On October 5th, so the day of the protest, it was leaked and spread in social media. And according to these instructions, the police had to step up both cyber patrolling of social media, so the cyber surveillance part of the story, but they were also instructed to operate what was called media management. And further on in the telegraph, it was further advised that police should make efforts to influence public opinion in order to make the public disagree with the protest, and to do so by building counter narratives against issues that discredit the government. Now, this was pretty startling for me, because this is usually not in the job description or the task description of national police, right? But they took this very seriously, and what we saw then, from mid-October and in the months after, is this very strong concerted amplification of the message that protest means anarchy. So, and this message was completely drowning out any kind of criticism against the omnibus law that was still, vibrant on social media as well as mainstream media. It was now replaced by this idea that the protest against the omnibus law has caused anarchy and should be condemned. So you could say that this case of the omnibus law controversy, it shows a sort of evolution of cyber policing here, which moves from, or it's sort of gliding scale perhaps, from reactive policing to proactive. So reactive is more implementing the law once it's broken. Proactive is when, when police engage in surveillance in order to find lawbreakers. And what we see in this case is then a sort of preemptive strike by building this narrative in order to manufacture public consensus and consent. And so at some point, it was completely silent. There was no protest against the omnibus law, which was, to me, quite impressive, actually, because just 2 weeks ago, I thought I was witnessing a revolution, because not just radical activists, but especially the moderate civil society groups were also so adamantly against the omnibus law. Didn't happen. Next slide. Yes, Bart.
Yeah, so a little bit on our finding in terms of who's funding all this, where does the money come from these kind of activities. And what's interesting for Indonesia, also comparatively with other countries, and is that this is not top-down, one-directional government funding. Yes, we found indication that sources close to cabinet ministers also donated or funded these campaigns. And by the way, when we say this is basically based on these interviews with these buzzers, and we ask them where the money comes from. It's their impressions or stories they heard from others about where the money comes from. So this is not, hardcore science where this is more giving you an idea of the rumors about this, basically, because that's as close as we could get. So, yes, sources around ministers, but also very often individual politicians and members of political parties, as well as business actors, as we saw in the case of the omnibus law controversy, who had interest in getting this bill passed, and also interest in currying favor with ruling politicians. So and this included also people that were necessarily not pro-government. So in Indonesia, you see a bit of a more mixed sphere where different forces all hire cyber troops for their own interests, and it's not necessarily top-down government propaganda, although in Indonesia, the campaigns that we documented here are we largely often found that the voices supporting government positions are the strongest, and that this is where most of the money comes from. So just to end this, to the final illustration, something on how cyber troops can also be used not just to create support for government policies, but also to weaken the opposition, which was one case we studied and we found particularly worrisome. So I'm going to share it briefly here based on an article from the partner in this research project and our Indonesian colleague, Wijayanto. And this is a story that starts on the 2nd February of 2021, when the sitting chairman of Partai Demokrat, Agus Yudhoyono, or AHY, gave a press conference and suddenly kind of out of the blue said, I'm aware that there are efforts going on to relieve me of my position, in some formulation like that, and which set all the rumors flying what was going on. And the background for why this was taken so seriously is that in Indonesia, the Partai Demokrat was basically the only serious big opposition party left, as most other parties had joined the coalition. And as Jokowi's ruling coalition had an interest in co-opting or getting support from Partai Demokrat, because at that time particularly there was talk about amending the constitution to allow Jokowi to have a third term as president, which is not particularly, maybe not something Jokowi wanted, but definitely the circles around him kept to maintain their closeness to power, so to say. So they had an interest in co-opting the Partai Demokrat. And that was serious, became clear, I think, later on the same day, when the chief of staff of Muldoko responded about the gossip that was then going on and said, there are efforts from Jokowi circles to replace AHY as chairman of the Democrat Party with Muldoko, with this clearly Jokowi associated person, who he denied it, of course, but in those kind of typical Indonesian words where he did suggest that if people want me as chairman, then, well, I might be open to it. And at the same time, or actually before that, I should say, already gossip started to emerge online that attacked the chairman, Agus Yudhoyono, directly about having an extramarital affair. And this picture particularly was shared that this was supposed to be the girl under the hashtag forbidden love. And we had interviews with buzzers who confirmed this, that this was a campaign that was started already a few months before. And then I should say the Congress that was then going on, that was then called the Extraordinary Party Congress, in which a vote for a new party leader would then be held. So his position was undermined, anticipating this. And then gradually, when we were getting closer to that conference in March 2021, you saw these kind of hashtags gaining traction. Muldoko, so the Jokowi person, will save the Democrat Party, and Muldoko is the right leader of the Partai Demokrat. And you see more, and you see this extraordinary party conference is the right thing to do, which AHY felt this was imposed on him. And here are just another one of those tweets that were then, you see this overview of the tweets are trending. And interesting here, you see SBY in Karma. SBY is the former Indonesian president, and Agus Yudhoyono is his son, who during his period has also intervened in the internal politics of an opposition party. So at that time, the particular thing that was made trending was, look, he did this, and so it's only right that this happens to his son now. Once you play it with drama, there will be karma, so to say. Also, a kind of probably smart content creator used this to normalize this idea that an intervention in internal politics of an opposition party is okay. Here are another few examples. So to cut that long story short, because we shouldn't talk too long, they succeeded at first in the sense that at this extraordinary conference, Muldoko was elected and got the majority of the votes to become the chairman of the Democrat Party. But then through a kind of using of some sort of ignored rules, AY could claim that this election and this extraordinary conference was illegal, and he got the broader election commission not to accept that result. So he was back or reinstated as leader of the opposition. So it was a narrow failure of a kind of cyber troop supported attempt of ruling elites in Indonesia to intervene in the internal politics of an opposition party. So what do we learn from this? What are a few general conclusions? And I'm just going to highlight a few and try to be brief. And Yatun, please add on if you want. Basically, 3 points I want to make. One is that the cyber troops are a tool for wealthy elites to defend their interests. Often these are ruling elites, sometimes they're opposition forces, but in any case, they are wealthy elites. And this means that for democracies in Southeast Asia that have already an oligarchic tendency, in the sense that they are already dominated by economic elites, social media is worsening that trend. In the sense that it gives another tool for economic elites to bend democratic procedures in their favor. And the adoption of the omnibus law, which is so much pro-business kind of law, is a very concrete example of that. So how is that related, just to bring it back to our original theme, to democratic backsliding? So if we go back to these 3 indicators of democratic backsliding, you see that we discussed concrete examples of this, of how firstly social media and cyber troops created acceptance for law that strengthened executive power. We discussed an example of an online campaign that was really intended to weaken opposition forces, and Yatun discussed cyber repression, as well as how these kind of online campaigns in general tend to weaken and distort public debate and enhance the kind of quality of public debate. So in that sense, we emphasize our argument is a bit different from the usual concern about social media, about creating these echo chambers and social media bubbles where people just repeat fake news among themselves. The problem here in Southeast Asia, that problem is also there, but the problem that we emphasized is rather how ruling elites control online content through cyber policing and hired cyber troops. So they use their money to actually create digital tools. They do so, we emphasize, also not necessarily with the explicit aim to undermine democracy or some sort of authoritarian fantasy, but rather to serve their predatory and illiberal agendas. That is to say, to continue their access to government funds, their position in power, and their attitudes towards to defend kind of legal reforms that support that. So not necessarily an authoritarian agenda. So what should be done? I just want to spend my last minute on this. There is a clear. It is not just an academic research. This is a topic that requires active engagement from us and many others about what to do with this trend that is growing and this threat that is also so pervasive. And we think there are at least three things, but it's open for discussion later on. The first one is why we do this research. That is to raise awareness of how this works, to expose cyber troops in how they're functioning, and in doing so, create some sort of public immunity against buzzers. And we see this already a little bit in Indonesia, where if you have Twitter debates, often people say, oh, that's a buzzer, and there are people actually labeling certain accounts as buzzer accounts. So that's important, I think, that kind of awareness is growing. But I think at the same time, we need to have a broader debate about what is ethical about how these digital tools, these cyber troops, are used. We find it highly unethical that the Indonesian government is funding these cyber troops to spread their views, but not in name of the government. Digital marketing, I think, is ethical. It's okay if a government account spread supports government policy, that makes sense. But the fact that it's being done in name of people that pretend to be normal citizens, or influencers that pretend to be just normal citizens expressing their opinion while they're actually paid, that's unethical, and that is a threat, and that needs to be labeled as such. A broader issue that is now very timely, given all the turmoil going on in Twitter, is also whether it would not be possible to curtail anonymous accounts and to curtail the number of accounts that you can have per person. Of course, that would greatly reduce the number of membership at say Facebook or Twitter, but I think it would have a really healthy effect on public debate on social media if this because it would curtail the cyber troop activity that we've been discussing. So with that, I just want to end with some sort of actionable conclusions of our research, and also with expressing that we hope to connect with other people working on this topic, because this needs a lot of work and more work. So maybe if through this lecture we do, then we'll be very open to this. And with that, I'll stop sharing my slides.
Bart and Yatun, thank you so much for this incredibly riveting talk, and also with the kind of talk on topics that has importance not just in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, but that is very prominently felt here in the US as well. So I'm going to open the floor to collecting some questions, but just to get us started off in sort of an easy manner, I have two questions. One has to do with the second example of selling the omnibus law. Just a quick question, because Yatun kind of invited this. How did the K-poppers get involved? How did that happen? And a question about one of the things that you ended with in the conclusion, namely the need to curtail anonymous accounts. Another thing that's very much in the news here in the US these days is Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter and the selling for $8 a month of these verified account checks. What do you think Elon Musk's influence on Twitter, what kind of reverberations or effects might that have on cyber troop activity and public opinion manipulation in the cyber world? So to start thinking about that as I'm inviting some other questions or people to put questions.
Shall I start with the fun question, the K-pop one? Well, as you probably know, in the United States as well, K-popers are actually increasingly known as activists. It's part of their self-identity. I remember the empty hall that was facing Donald Trump in several years back, because K-popers had reserved all these seats, and it's almost a sort of ideological battle between Gen Z, which they stand for, and cyber troops. It kind of almost replaces the labels conservative versus progressive or so. That's so they've been involved in activism also since the KPK law case, and that was actually the first time that they showed and discovered their power on Twitter, as a form of activism in Indonesia, and this only snowballed in the case of the omnibus law. So yeah, we might expect more from them in the future. But of course, they're also the most vulnerable because they are regular teens and the first to probably decide to shut up and not post, at least not openly political stuff when they are risking, you know, prosecution and imprisonment while they're still in high school, for instance. Short answer.
Yeah, and on the Musk takeover of Twitter, I mean, I've been also following this with my mouth open, so to say, and kind of trying to get my handle about what's going on here. And I at this particular moment in time, I don't have more clue than any of you about where this will go and what this will mean for Twitter use in the future. Just yesterday, there were other predictions that it would shut down today, for example. But it is an irony of this whole episode that the deal almost backfired because Musk complained that there were so many fake accounts, which, given our research, made me smile because, I mean, that is what a lot of that cybertroop activity that we discuss indeed thrive on, that of one individual having a lot of accounts. And I think if he would actually be concerned about it, that would be great. That's hence my third point in the last slide. I don't think the verified account thing that was there, or the way that he kind of undermined it right now, has any impact on that, because there used to be only verified accounts of businesses or elite persons, which would anyway not be normal kind of people. And now that everybody would be able to buy that, would basically be a possibility for buzzer to up their status. So these would be the first people that would buy that blue tick, I think. So in that sense, a worrying trend. But let's see where this is going. Maybe Twitter would be gone, and actually our concern about this social media is gone at the moment. Might also be.
And it's very interesting because much of the type of social media propaganda, like hashtag battles, right? This surge of becoming top trending making top trending that KPK is Taliban. It's very much shaped by the affordances, the kind of technical affordances of Twitter. So it might be very interesting to see if everyone decides to migrate to, I don't know, Mastodon or a different kind of platform, if this kind of dynamic, if the kind of propaganda needs to evolve as well. But actually, in a lot of countries, we found Facebook is also still a very important platform to spread propaganda. WhatsApp, Instagram, so it's not just Twitter.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to get a sense of our audience members to see if I am missing any questions or raised hands, because I have a ton of questions listed, but I'm going to be quiet for just a moment to see if I'm missing something. And also, audience members, please raise your hand and speak up if you don't want me to keep on firing off questions. But until that happens, I wanted to know a little bit more about the cyber troopers, or these buzzers themselves, because on the one hand, they remind me of well, the people sort of hired by politicians, well over a decade ago, who would get free t-shirts and some money to stage a demo in favor of any particular political candidate, which seemed to happen in a very transactional manner. And I'm wondering to what extent there's any kind of ideological alignment between at least some of these buzzers or cyber troopers and the kind of message that they're whether they're paid to sort of spread. Are there any overlaps, or is this just purely business, purely transactional? But I'm also curious about the aspect of creativity involved for influencers to build a following or to create content in a way that is appealing, and also in a way that well, power holders might want to pay them for. So what are the rewards for being a buzzer? There is the money to a certain extent, but is this also a good for those creative content creators? Is this something you can put in your CV or your portfolio in some kind of way? Or is this a way for, you brought gender into this a little bit as well, that many of these buzzers or cyber troopers seem to be male, but I'm also thinking of young female influencers and the kind of following that they might have. Are there overlaps there? So beyond the purely transactional and immediate financial rewards for this, what are motivations? Are they ideological, creative, anything else?
Maybe Bart, you can draw, because you're the expert in election campaigns and transactional politics here.
Yeah.
Then I can.
Well, I'll start, and then you can follow up on some of
Sure.
the other things on their motivation. So what we found, and what indeed, having studied election campaigns in Indonesia, what really really surprised me, but also found interesting, is that it seemed this phenomena of cyber troops has really grown out of election campaigning. And even the forms that it currently takes still mimics or mirrors success teams, which is how election team or election organizing teams are called. So very often, people that become buzzers start off just reporting themselves to a campaign of the presidential candidate or gubernatorial candidate, or sometimes even the district head. And they're being placed on a social media team, and then finding that they like it, that they're good at it, and then continuing. Or that end, I should say, that politicians also, out of that experience, realized, hey, this is so useful, we should use this beyond election campaigns. I think this is how it started. It started just as an election campaign kind of thing. And then politicians and funders realized, why not we keep doing this to support legislative initiatives like the KPK bill or the Omnibus Law bill. So it became a more routine thing that there wasn't before. And as that became more pragmatic, I think the buzzers themselves also became more pragmatic. We interviewed several who started out being idealistic and who supported as candidate because they felt they were really good for Indonesia and they should win the elections. But gradually that kind of idealism got mixed with, hey, I'm having a job, I'm getting a quite okay income out of this, feeling, enjoying the thrill of pushing certain things on the internet and seeing it go viral and all that. So it's not to give my most direct answer to your question. It's not fully transactional and money oriented. There is a certain level of ideology or at least political motivation behind it. But I wouldn't overestimate that also. The money is definitely a factor. And we also interviewed people who said, well, basically, I just do it for the money, and I do whoever pays me.
Well, if I can add to that, for sure, there was this very shift. And, like Bart also says, it's becoming an industry, a flex job, like any other almost. But what we do see is the more it becomes a game, right, rather than an actual campaign where you actually try to defeat the opponent. We see that ideological concerns are still lingering, but become slightly different. In some of the interviews, there was a very strong sense that they were fighting a sort of moral crusade. And that was not even tied to one particular candidate or anything, but just defeating the opponent was the moral objective there, because the opponent was evil. And, it's like playing a computer game almost, where you try to defeat the opponent, the evil monster. Either the evil monster is, the extremist Muslim, which is how the opposition is often caricatured, or the evil opponent is the neoliberal capitalist oppressive regime, as Jokowi is being pictured by the opponents there. So yeah.
Wonderful, thank you for that. We have a question from Adrian Wu, and Adrian, I just want to ask you, do you want to ask your question yourself, or would you like me to read it? I'm going to allow you to talk, so please speak up if you want to, and otherwise, if you prefer not to, I'll just read your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so thank you so much for such a riveting and interesting presentation. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I thought you brought up a lot of food for thought. I had some questions about curtailing anonymous accounts that you brought up, namely that anonymity might be important to protect the identity of activists or those who might face discrimination, such as LGBTQ+. So what would your recommendations be for cracking down on inauthentic anonymous actors without affecting those who are legitimate? And additionally, if laws are already being used for repressing good faith actors, then how can we make sure that laws are upheld in ways that target buzzer accounts and are not misused? Is this something that should be reinforced domestically or through some kind of international framework or norms?
Yes, great. Thank you for directing the discussion towards what could be done. Shall I go first, Yatun, or you want to go first? Basically, there are two elements to your question. And on the first, yeah, I agree with you. And this was raised in earlier discussions we had, that curtailing anonymous accounts should not go as far as to prevent people from having anonymous accounts, because they are important for the reason you mentioned, that people might face discrimination if they would be active online in their own personal name, particularly under a oppressive regime. So what I would see as curtailing anonymous account would be more like curtailing the number of accounts that a person could have. So that it would be limited to, say, 3 or 4. So you could still be able to post things anonymously, but not have 20, 30, 40, 50 accounts that has been really enabling these buzzers to do what they do. That I think would be the way forward. And in terms of with your second question is also, well, like what should be a law or what should be government policy in this? And indeed, I'm also a bit wary that, of government regulating this, because there's a risk they do this in their own benefit. I think some of this should come out of public debate and the kind of discussions we have here, like when we had new vehicles like cars or bicycles, we also had to develop an ethic of how they move on the road and what to do and how. And I think with social media, what we need also is a kind of ethical spreading a new kind of, or creating a kind of ethics to what is done and what's not done. Like selling your opinions or spreading opinions online because you get paid, not done. Governments funding others to spread their policies in the name of a normal citizen also should not be not done. And maybe through some sort of ethical discussion, we already could develop those kind of norms rather than a law. Although, government saying we are not going to fund cyber troop activities would be a step forward, obviously.
Well, actually, there's been a lot of discussion recently. What month is it? Yeah. So almost 5 months ago, June, the head of the election committee, Bawaslu, what is that? The National Election
Supervisory Committee, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They were already anticipating that buzzer activity would go up, in the run-up to the 2024 elections. And they were already discussing new, not necessarily new laws, because the laws are already in place in the form of anti-fake news laws, but new stepped up measures to kind of stop buzzers. But in one breath, he said, well, probably it won't work, because, if we suppress one buzzer, 100 more will arise. And we will never know who's behind them. And this was what he literally said to journalists. So, but in addition to what Bart just suggested, I think what would also help is to broaden the definition of what buzzers do and what cyber troopers, what kind of impact they have, to broaden the objective of what we need to curtail, to take it away from just fake news, right? Because there's a lot of anti-fake news talk, a lot of anti or hoax, as they're called in Indonesia. And this is where a lot of policy and a lot of civil society activism also gets stuck. We have to stop hoaxes. And the government agrees, yes, we have to stop hoaxes. But then, of course, it's a very flexible kind of category to curtail. So to kind of move the public discourse away from just disinformation, fake news or hoax, but actually unethical, manipulation, and name that explicitly, that would already help to kind of bring in the ethical dimension to the discussion.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your answers. I thought it was really helpful. And thank you for making the distinction about changing the definition. I hope that we can move that forward that way, so we can make some changes.
Yeah,
Can I just return a question? Maybe if you want to be drawn into this, but I have been having a little bit of conversation with American colleagues that at first said, well, there's nothing like this in the US, these kind of paid forces. But gradually, I also spoke to people that say, yeah, well, there are some indication that this is happening in the US too. Is any of you, are you aware of say around the elections you just had, whether there are such influencing campaigns going on?
Personally, I'm not aware of that happening, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it did happen. I know that in the past there was discussion about Russian influence, of course, in American elections. I don't know about the recent midterms. My focus is more on soft power in terms of Taiwan. So I actually have heard a lot of discussion about similar types of things being done in China with, I think they're called like water troops. But I'm not as familiar with the particulars of the US.
Water troops, interesting. Yeah.
It's very interesting that you mentioned.
Oh, sorry. Just as maybe a message to all of us, it might be nice to keep this in mind. And if we come across something like this, let Bart and Yatun know.
Yes.
Might offer some nice comparative material.
No, we'd be very interested in that. I just want to say that it's interesting that you mentioned the case of Taiwan, because here we see, it reminds me of the role that Chinese diaspora also play in spreading propaganda. I've read somewhere about, Chinese diaspora also spreading anti-Taiwan propaganda wherever they're located to kind of influence public sentiment in their host country, so to speak. And Bart, you remember the Papua case where suddenly fake news about Papua was creeping up on Dutch social media, which was also or seemed to be organized from Indonesia. So it's kind of complicates things even more.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I have also done some research into the cases of Australia. And I think it is quite interesting how they're using WeChat in order to kind of influence the opinions of diaspora. And one problem too is that they can be quite separated from different communities due to their language barriers. So, by providing this sort of platform for them to talk in Chinese, that kind of also can limit their opinions, and they can't rely so much on local news. So that also creates a lot of challenges.
Yeah, interesting.
So I would like to leave some space for one potential final question, but also want to be mindful of the fact that this is officially the end of this meeting. And we do know that Bart and Yatun are in a very different time zone. It might be getting just a little bit late in the Netherlands.
It's 10:30, so we're still awake.
On a Friday night, you might be ready to start your weekend. So if nobody has any questions right now, but of course you should feel very free to follow up through email, and I can always connect you to Bart and Yatun, and so can Brian. I suggest we thank Bart and Yatun very, very much for this wonderful talk, and hope to see them here, welcome them here sometime in person.
Yes, I hope so. That would be great.
And thank you for having us. That was very nice.
Yeah, and what Sylvia said, because we're just about to start the comparative study, we're really looking forward for any input or comparative material. Yeah, that would be very interesting and helpful.
So I'll stay on the Zoom for a little bit longer to thank Bart and Yatun in person. But anybody else, unless you have a question, you should feel very free to leave or follow up later through email.